and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alistair.
And I'm Nick.
And in this episode, we will be reviewing Mother, the new film from Darren Aronofsky, starring Jennifer Lawrence and Javier Bardem. Then we'll be discussing whether writers should write about writers. But before all of that, Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, I've read another non-fictional book following finishing that Sapiens epic. This was a slightly shorter one. It was In Bed with Games. That's in bed as in embedded reporter, although, yes, the double meaning is very much, I think, intentional, by the now former games journalist Carver Ellison, which I think came out a couple of years back, a result of a Patreon thing where she lived as a digital nomad for a year and wrote approximately an article a month based on her going and basically staying with a game developer, normally a sort of more interesting indie game developer. Well, more interesting to her. I'm sure non-indie game developers are interesting as well, but yeah, she wasn't really staying with the developers of Halo or anything. These are people who make indie games that I, someone with a slightly passing relationship to the games industry, had never heard of. There's a game called Down Well where you fall down a well shooting people with guns on your foot. And there's the game which is meant to replicate the experience of having sex for the first time with someone you meet on an online game. Obviously, I don't play video games really at all, and haven't for years, so in some ways it was a slightly odd thing to decide to read. But I don't know, I used to follow Cara Ellison on Twitter, and she was one of these people, much like the other one being Yahtzee Croshaw, who does zero punctuation, who could overcome my disinterest in games through sheer sort of quality of writing. So yeah, I read her book and it was good. It was obviously there was lots of stuff about games, but you know I may not play games, but I know enough of them to understand the pros. And she was mostly talking to these people in a sort of profile type way about their background and their creative process and so on. So as a fellow wanky creative type, the type we will be destroying during the latter half of this podcast, I imagine. Yeah, I quite enjoyed it.
Did she arrive at any conclusions about either games developers or being a digital nomad?
I think she seemed to refrain a bit from going too self-indulgently in depth about her digital nomadry. There's usually a little bit in every chapter about how she's doing, but mostly she keeps it quite focused on the people. She conveyed the sort of the fact that it was quite tiring. I think she definitely felt like she was ready to stop after a year of doing this. I think her main conclusion about being a digital nomad is, I'm not sure how people who do this for longer than a year do it. I'm physically and mentally exhausted because it was just so disorientating and tiring, and especially because a lot of the time she was just sleeping on people's sofas and stuff. I think there's only about 2 out of the 12 chapters or something where she actually gets to sleep in a bed. It sounds a bit punishing.
Yeah, that does actually, yeah. It does sound like a very interesting book.
It is good. I mean, you've done more gaming than me in your time, so you might actually get more out of it. But yeah, it is a decent book, even if you don't fully like games. If you do like games, I imagine it might even be even better. Anyway, yes, what have you been up to since the last podcast?
Well, I've been revisiting a band that I am a huge fan of and used to be probably my favourite band. I've been listening to a lot of Pink Floyd, certainly from about kind of 17, 18, 19, into my late teens, early 20s. Pink Floyd were like my favourite band, and I listened to them a lot. So I've been listening to them a lot recently in a sort of nostalgia trip, partly because I went to see the Victorian Albert Museum in London has a big retrospective on the entire career of Pink Floyd. Absolutely enormous exhibition. So I spent about 2.5 hours there last week looking at the sort of installation they've got for every single Pink Floyd album, including live albums. So it's pretty big.
Including live albums. Excellent.
Yeah, what I consider like the official live albums, the Pompeii one, Delicate Sound of Thunder and Pulse. But it was a really fascinating exhibition, and it really reminded me like how good Pink Floyd are and what they do, and especially really enjoyed re-listening to Dark Side of the Moon, the way they weave the unusual sounds and the different sort of layers of sort of sound effects, strange voices, instruments kind of moving in and out, and create this like one long piece of music that can be broken up into individual songs. You know, I've forgotten how good it is, and it is like a really great, engrossing piece of music. I also really enjoyed re-listening to Wish You Were Here. It's hard to choose a favourite album, but it's either Wish You Were Here or The Wall. The Wall is very good as well.
I was going to say, isn't Dark Side of the Moon the sort of... Is that the big famous signature one?
That's the seminal album, yeah, Dark Side of the Moon. I think it's one of the biggest selling albums of all time. It's certainly their most sort of successful and biggest selling album.
And like all hardcore fans, you prefer one of the other ones?
Yeah, I mean, Dark Side of the Moon is great. Don't get me wrong, it is a really good album, and I did really enjoy listening to it again. But I really like The Wall, which is the double album they did. I think one of the few double albums that actually justifies being a double album. Most double albums you listen to and you get the feeling there's a better single album screaming to be let out.
Yeah.
But The Wall, actually, I think, is one of the few albums that does justify being a double album. And Wish You Were Here, the album they wrote about early band member Syd Barrett, who had to leave because he unfortunately had a mental breakdown. They really wrote this album about him called Wish You Were Here, which is a very beautiful and very poignant album, so I do really like that. But yeah, so that was a good nostalgia trip.
Yeah, I must admit, I've never heard Pink Floyd because a lot of my relationship with classic music is similar to my relationship with classic film. So, yeah, maybe I should get Dark Side of the Moon on Spotify and see if I can get something from it.
Yeah, I'd say Dark Side of the Moon is a good place to start. You've got all the classic Floyd elements, and is obviously, their seminal album. Wish You Were Here also, I think that was the one I listened to first. That's very good, and again has all the seminal Floyd elements, kind of long songs, different movements, bits moving in and out of each other, unusual sound effects.
Yeah.
So either start with one of those two, I would say, if anyone wants to get into Pink Floyd.
Okay, and for our review this week, we're talking about Mother, the new film by Darren Aronofsky, and that's Mother all lowercase with an exclamation mark. So, personally, I've moved towards pronouncing it Mother myself, but I'm not going to do that throughout the review because I suspect everyone would stop listening and send me death threats. So anyway, yes, this is the new film from Darren Aronofsky, the new, quite controversial film. There seems to be extreme polarisation among the reviews and audiences and people I've seen on Twitter about whether this is a work of genius, a complete, staggering, pretentious failure, or somewhere in between. It may shock you to learn that I'm probably going to come down somewhere in between. So the plot of Mother, very roughly, is there's a house. In this house lives a poet, played by Javier Bardem, and his younger wife, played by Jennifer Lawrence, and he's having writer's block. She's redecorating the house. They're living this sort of peaceful life alone, but people just keep turning up. People just keep, in small numbers at first. I think the first two are just a couple played by Ed Harris and Michelle Pfeiffer who turn up and make their life a little bit awkward, but more people follow and things escalate from there. In terms of where it goes after the social awkwardness intro, it goes to some strange places. If you haven't already looked up where it goes or seen it, odds are you may not have successfully guessed where it goes. It goes a bit flying over the top. And yeah, I personally saw this film without having any of it spoilt for me, and I must admit I kind of recommend that myself. But also, in order to discuss this in any meaningful way, because it's quite a sort of slow, sparse film in a lot of ways, we're probably going to have to at least spoil, or at least imply some spoilers for the rest of the film. So yes, if you do have visions of seeing Mother completely virginal and unspoilt, I would perhaps recommend not listening to this review yet, because we're going to struggle to say anything substantial without at least hinting at spoilers, I think.
Yeah.
And with that tentative warning out the way, Alistair, what did you think of this film?
Well, as you say, it's been polarising people, and I think I also come down in somewhere in the middle. Looking at people's reaction, I seem to think, am I the only person who thinks this film is just okay? I don't mean okay as in it's, on balance all right, like a comedy that's a little bit funny. It's more the fact that, like, when it does what it's trying to do well, it is really, really good. And when it kind of fails at what it's going to do, it can fall into, being quite bad, or at least completely over the top. So, I don't know, it's kind of weird. Like, I think it averages out to be okay, but kind of through kind of peaks of brilliance and troughs of being a bit ridiculous. It certainly had good bits. Like, it was quite an ambitious film. It was quite interesting and unusual. The plot is quite different to, I don't think I've seen a film really like it. And it's got goes in some interesting directions, and it's quite creepy at places. Not like scary, you can jump out of your skin, but there's certainly, some sort of quite unpleasantly creepy scenes. So it does have good bits in it, and then when it kind of nails its kind of atmosphere of things spinning out of control, it can be quite emotionally intense. But it doesn't sustain that, intensity throughout the entire film, or it certainly doesn't sustain it in a engaging way throughout.
Yeah, I mean, the first 2/3 are basically just sort of creepy horror combined with a sort of almost social awkwardness comedy. Yeah, I'm not saying this film is like Peep Show goes dark, but I'm also saying it's not a million miles away from that.
Yeah.
And, there's blood coming through the walls and stuff as well, but a lot of it is just that these people won't leave, and Jennifer Lawrence is increasingly sort of trying to be polite and compel ourselves not to yell at them. We are going to be referring to the characters as their actors, by the way, because they don't have names. Well, I think Jennifer Lawrence might be credited as Mother, but that would just confuse everybody. So anyway, but yeah, the first 2/3, I think I was actually kind of with it. I was kind of liking it for, I think, slightly sincere way. And then it goes kind of balls out into weirdness towards the end, and I don't know. I'd probably say I came out on the positive side of this, in that I came out of the film thinking I enjoyed seeing that, I'm glad I saw it, but I must admit I spent a lot of the final third sort of laughing at how ridiculous it was getting. I don't know if I was quite say I was laughing at it in a really savage, derisive way, but I don't know. I do kind of feel like I might have been meant to take the last third of this a bit more seriously than I personally was taking it. I was like, wow, this is ridiculous. I can't wait to see what ridiculous thing happens next. Although, and then, again, I'm really dancing on the chasm of spoilers here. And then after, just as I was sort of settling into, okay, this is no longer Creepy Peep Show, this is batshit allegory, as a lot of people have pointed out, and as I believe Aronofsky's flat out said in his artistic statements, I've read around it, this is about a combination of the creative process, how the poet Javier Bardem somewhat uses his muse Jennifer Lawrence, and also it's a sort of biblical allegory with Javier Bardem as God and Jennifer Lawrence as Mother Earth, or Mother, if you prefer. And obviously that's there, and you can see that. So I did quite enjoy the sheer ludicrousness of it, but when it gets properly violent and unpleasant, and there is some properly, Jesus Christ, stuff in the last few minutes.
Yeah.
It was hard to square that with the fact that I've just been chuckling along to how stupid it was throughout the previous 20 minutes, to be honest. So it was a bit of a shonky back and forth experience of jarring emotional confusion, which I'm not sure the director entirely meant. I think he might have been trying to make a more coherent point about climate change or something. But yeah, apart from the slightly jarring bit of pain to my face in the final few minutes, I was not unentertained, just as I say. I'm not entirely sure it was for the reason the director wanted. Yeah,
this is one of the things that is, like I say, when the film isn't good, or one of the problems with it. As you say, I agree that like the first kind of 2/3 to 75% of kind of escalating tension is very good. And I think the way the film kind of raises the tension throughout the film as more and more people show up, and how kind of Jennifer Lawrence's life and control over, her own home, which is sort of the thing that she has, kind of spins out of control. How it kind of ramps up, I think, is handled very well, and how the tension goes, sort of increases. And then, like I say, it's one of those films when like he's just kind of raising the tension and always pushing kind of the stakes a bit higher. And then there comes a point when like it sort of departs reality, because like there's nowhere kind of realistic left for the tension to be raised to, but he wants to keep raising the tension. I think it kind of relies on you kind of buying into the conceit of it. Again, I'm sort of dancing around some spoilers.
You mean the sort of biblical allegory stuff?
Yeah, but also the fact that, I guess we're going to probably go into full spoilers at this point, which is in the end of the film, people kind of continue to show up at the poet's house, and they get more and more people show up, and basically they sort of start to go a bit mad, and they take over the house and start kind of destroying it, fighting each other, starting some kind of cult worshipping the poet, and it just kind of gets more and more ridiculous. And you kind of have to buy into the conceit that the words that this man has written, this poet, are so beautiful and so powerful and people just want to be near him to the point it basically drives them all insane.
I see what you mean. No one cares about poetry that much.
Yeah, or just you have to kind of believe it. I mean, they did a quite good job of like not actually having any of the poetry read out. So they do some bits like there's a bit when the Jennifer Lawrence character reads the poetry he's written, and she kind of sees a sort of visual metaphor of like a house burning down and then life coming back into it. And you kind of get a sense of the emotion that the writing taps into without them. Because if they actually had the writing in the film, it would just be a letdown, because you can never believe whatever it said. You can never believe that it would drive people insane. But you have to buy into that premise. And if you don't, then it's silly.
I mean, towards the end, yes. For people form cults, there's, among other things, there's heavy gun violence. It is hard, you have to acknowledge some of the biblical stuff, or at least the idea that this is meant to be not just about, how awesome poetry is, or indeed how awesome any form of art is, but to an extent about the idea that this is about people having wars over religion. If you don't buy into some of this aggressively literal allegory stuff, then, as you say, the film's just bollocks.
Yeah, so that's kind of the problem. And if you don't buy into
the film's just bollocks. That is a problem.
That is a problem if you don't buy into the allegory, or you don't buy into the sort of premise. And that's why it can be unintentionally funny, because when you get to the point of you see people just sort of ripping down the house, and like it can all come across as sort of like this is just like silliness. It comes across as kind of like the bit in Black Books when Bernard just completely flips out and starts trying to cook his own oven. That it's so over the top, it's silly. Unless you kind of completely committed to the premise, then I guess you could interpret it as being brilliant.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I say, the problem was in some ways, I guess I was enjoying it on the level of some sort of I guess in a similar way to how I enjoyed the recent Preacher show, a sort of escalating silliness, oh my god, they went there, chuckle fest.
Yeah.
Which will take you to a certain degree, but at some point he just flies out of even that level of reality, and it's just, okay, we have to accept that we have departed anything that resembles the real world and entered pretentious art film land, the world where auteur directors roam wild. And I think a fair bit of the backlash towards this film has been that I think there is an increasing level of weariness in a lot of areas of the culture with pretentious middle-aged auteur directors. And particularly pretentious middle-aged auteur directors who have decided to couch their biblical allegory in a story about a struggling artist. I think there is definitely something, about this film which, if you are annoyed with a degree of sort of pretentious art film culture and, again, middle-aged men lionising themselves, I can see why this film would just make you want to hold it down and punch it.
Yeah, I can see that. And again, you have to buy into the conceit of, like, he's a great poet and he's, like, doing, like, sterling work and he's, like,
He's like a god, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And like he writes everything on like parchments with like a quill or like a sort of ink pen. All he talks about is there's like death and then there's life and then like life comes from death and things like that. And it's, if you buy into the premise of like this man is like tapping into these like deep core human emotions and these like universal truths and expressing them in like an accessible way, or if you don't accept the premise, then it's a man on a bit of a sort of self-indulgent trip and then later a self-indulgent power trip.
See, yeah, I mean, I think the premise is unacceptable, to be honest. I think unless you accept that we're away with the fairies in art film land, and this is about God, you're never going to get this film must make you want to kill yourself. I mean, this is somewhat directly cribbed from the Overinvested podcast about it, which is a good episode of Overinvested, by the way, if you want to go away and listen to their review of Mother. They, I think, go into possibly even more spoilers than we do. But yeah, I think this film, one of the reasons why it's been slightly badly received is that it's been slightly misleadingly marketed as a sort of thriller film, because like we saw an advert for this film, and firstly that advert was really annoying because it had this punishing voiceover or on-screen text or something going, you will remember where you were when you saw Mother, and they didn't pronounce it Mother, and it was annoying. And secondly, it was very sort of brown shots of Jennifer Lawrence looking lonely in rooms whilst blood spatters everywhere. And if you're turning up for a grindy horror film, I can see why you might have got away disappointed with Javier Bardem's adventures in weird biblical poetry. Yeah,
you're completely right. It's one of the things sometimes about art house films, which is that like people very much like their films marketed in identifiable preset packages, and if your film doesn't quite fit into one of the packages, then it can be an issue in that either you market the film as like, this film is different, generally people don't like things that are different, or you kind of force it into one of the pre-existing packages, which is what seems to have happened here. That's been forced into the kind of horror thriller package. And obviously that can lead to audiences being disappointed when they don't get what they thought they were buying from the package. Or sometimes people can be pleasantly surprised and like, oh, that actually turned out to be better than a generic thriller.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it works seamlessly brilliantly enough, unfortunately, to quite sell that. I mean, I mostly quite enjoyed it in all the ways I've already described. It could possibly have been a bit shorter. There were a few sequences of Jennifer Lawrence just walking slowly around this house, so I was a bit sort of, come on, don't bore us, get to the chorus.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I know it's an art film, and going into an art film with don't bore us, get to the chorus is another route to unhappiness. But, yeah, I felt like there were occasions where, even during the creepy bit at the beginning, which largely worked, so I was a bit sort of, yeah, all right, come on.
To say something nice about the film, or to defend it for a bit, because I didn't think it was terrible. It has flaws, but one of the reasons why I guess it does sort of fit into the thriller packaging a bit is that there were some really quite creepy bits in this film, quite visceral scenes of violence. There was a sort of rising tension throughout quite a lot of it, especially towards the end when it gets into the kind of some of the most extreme violence or some of the most kind of shocking bits of the film. Those scenes did stay with me for quite a while. I did find myself on the way home from the cinema, still feeling a bit out of my skin, a bit, I don't know, like something had, got under my skin and kind of messed me around a bit. And even like the day after and the day after that, I was still find myself being drawn back to some of the more shocking and unpleasant bits of the film. Like I couldn't get them out of my head. It did get into me and rile me up a bit. And it had like a sort of lasting emotional impact. Much more so than, say, It. The guy's not without talent, and the film is not without power.
Well, yeah, I mean, the bits towards the very end, as I say, I mean, yes, they did, snap me out of my sort of, I'm slightly chuckling along at this silliness phase, but yeah, that's because they were incredibly visceral and, as you say, powerful. I mean, I've actually seen one of his previous films, Black Swan, the famous ballet film Black Swan, which I probably don't need to talk about as if I've just discovered it. But, yeah, there's some stuff in that, isn't there, with the things that happen to the ballerina's body, which are quite viscerally... Yeah, I can still hear some of those noises in my head as well. And clearly he can, get those sort of horrible, visceral things across when he wants to.
Yeah, in fact, all of his films, at least all the ones I've seen, have one really kind of unpleasant bit that stings you. Yes, definitely some of the body horror in Black Swan. And also the ending of his first film, Pi, which is a very good film. And certainly if you like Mother, probably similar concept but better executed. It has a quite disgusting, shocking bit at the end. And also another good film he made, Requiem for a Dream, has a quite, unpleasant scene towards the end. So he's got form for really unsettling scenes that get under your skin. Like I say, it's not easy to do in cinema, especially as a lot of thrillers or horror movies go for like the bang jump of kind of lots of quiet, then a big bang, or just have something that's just straightforward, just incredibly grotesque. Whereas this does a good job of creating rising tension, creating strong atmosphere, and kind of subtly putting you out of sorts.
Well, yeah, I don't think I'm saying that, famous director Aronofsky has made something that's, technically incompetent. It may have some issues as a whole, but he obviously hasn't made a film that's just a complete incoherent disaster where he's just accidentally pointed the camera at the ceiling. I mean, ultimately, one of the reasons perhaps why I enjoyed it on some level is maybe it's one of these sort of talented person makes interesting failure films that are honestly almost more fun to review than they would be to just watch uncritically. Sometimes I see good, really amazing films and I think, it might actually be more fun to watch this just as a viewer rather than watch this thinking, how could I talk about this on my podcast? This is a film where, to be honest, I'm very happy I have a podcast to talk about it on. This is a prime interesting failure.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right with the interesting failure. And it did fail to achieve what it set out to achieve, but in an interesting way. And I did like the fact that it was ambitious and that it tried to do something different. I mean, I quite like unusual arty films and unusual arty music and stuff. See above Pink Floyd section.
Yeah.
And things like that. And sometimes like unusual arty books and whatever. So I kind of, maybe this is more my sort of thing. I can see why some people might see that it tips over into being pretentious, but I did like the fact that it tried to be different. It did try to do something unusual, in big scare quotes, push the medium forwards or something like that. Or
Yes.
I like that it kind of, the fact that it reached for more was really interesting and tried to do this, like tell this bigger story and this unusual story. But yes, it fell flat, but I'm kind of glad that they tried, because last year we reviewed some kind of very unambitious, competent success stories like Star Trek Beyond. Good film, tight as fuck, I think, as you described at the time. Didn't really try to do anything unusual, push boundaries or aspire to more. And I know maybe the third film in a Star Trek franchise and the 13th or something Star Trek film overall, it probably isn't the place to start pushing boundaries. But I did like the fact that this film did.
Well, yeah, as you say, we don't cover that many films like this in our remit of, moderate fantasy violence, 12A action films. So yes, it is always fun to occasionally get to talk about something a little bit odd. Okay, so moving on from Mother itself, our related discussion point of the week is, should writers write about writers? Because, as I implied, hinted at, flat out said during that discussion, one of the reasons this film has been perhaps a bit raked over the coals is the decision to talk about writing and writer's block in perhaps a somewhat pretentious, involved way. I mean, or, again, if you want to buy into the allegory, have a writer who is also God. So, should writers escape these stereotypes by just never writing about writers again? Alistair, what do you think?
Well, I've thought about this for a bit, and the conclusion that I have arrived at is that writing itself, the act of writing, is quite an internal process, which doesn't actually work great in a visual medium like cinema. Like, for example, the film Mother doesn't have a lot to say about writing other than the fact that, like, the main character is either writing or not writing, and it kind of flat out states that. What's interesting in films about writers, or TV shows or books, is that the kind of the drama that's around the writing. And the most interesting stories tend to be either the story the writer is trying to tell in their writing, or the kind of events around it. A good example is The Shining, which is not much about writing in it. The story itself is about what goes on around the writing.
Your conclusion is the act of writing isn't interesting.
I don't know, another good example is the film Adaptation, starring Nicolas Cage, which is, one of the it's the first film that pops into my head when I was trying to think of a film about writing. And obviously, yes, about the process of adapting a book into a film. But the main story itself, even the story is about the Nicolas Cage character trying to struggling to write this film script. Mainly, so the meat of the film is about the story he's trying to tell in the adaptation, not the actual process itself, and also how his story of adapting the film wraps into the story that he's trying to tell, rather than so much about the sort of creative process itself.
Yeah, I think possibly the danger is that it's coming close to treating the creative process like it's some sort of universal human thing. Obviously we are both aspiring writers in various mediums ourselves, and so, we've both, I'm sure, at some point in our lives wrestled with whether we should write an epic novel about a man trying to write an epic novel. And I think the main thing that always stopped me from doing it is the idea that ultimately writing a book isn't as universal as an emotion as I perhaps would need it to be for something like that to really work. I mean, if I want to write about a man walking down the street, you can just say he walks down the street. You probably want to describe the street a bit, but you can sort of generally assume that most people in your sort of audience of people in roughly your culture who buy books would probably understand walking down the street. But talking about, thinking about your novel or sitting down to face the challenge of the blank page, I think there's a danger of thinking that's some sort of thing that everyone's totally understands, whereas in actual fact it's just, you and your friends in the same field and other people in the same field, which it turns out isn't that big a cross-section of humanity.
Yeah, I do think there is a problem sometimes with writers assuming that writing is a sort of universal experience everyone can relate to, which is why some stories about writers can tip over into basically coming across as quite self-indulgent.
Or pretentious films about the torture of the creative.
Yeah, exactly. And also, even the process of writing is not even universal for all writers, because everyone goes about it slightly differently. So it's even hard to make a film that is a kind of universal writing experience. I mean, there's lots of people out there who, write poetry, short stories, books, what have you. Many people who aren't published or successful. There's the old cliche of, everyone's got a novel in them.
But not in a sex way. Carry on.
No.
we did. No. That was a few episodes ago.
Yeah, we did cover that. But I lost my thread.
Sorry.
Yeah, the writer's experience is not universal to every writer, and even though there are a lot of people out there who write or, have a novel in them in a sexy or unsexy way, it's hard to draw that out to a universal experience.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in terms of the process, just to be clear, when we talk somewhat divisively about writers writing about writing, obviously I'm not talking about, practical handbooks. We are talking about, fiction about writers here.
Yeah, like The Shining or Adaptation or Mother.
Yeah, I mean, it probably doesn't help that even within writing circles, there's a lot of pressure. Pressure is probably the wrong word. There's a lot of enthusiasm to see writing as, just a job rather than a heavenly vocation sent down from on high, to encourage people through the early stages to think, writers are just people doing a job, therefore you shouldn't deify them, which is probably another strike against Mother, and partly to encourage people to pay them fairly for their work and for consumers to actually understand that this is years of someone's life and you probably shouldn't pirate it. Yeah. So possibly against that movement or that mindset, films which really get up into the important wankiness of creativity maybe seem increasingly not the point even to, actual writers.
Yeah, that's one of the things that kind of where it tips over to being self-indulgent, if you're kind of equating your work, in essence, your job, with some kind of religious devotion.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's the podcast Ditch Diggers, which was nominated for, and sadly did not win, but it's still a good podcast, even though it didn't win the Hugo. That is a writing podcast, but its entire point is that the writer is, much like the ditch digger, he or she too is just turning up and doing a job, and it shouldn't necessarily be raised up above all other jobs as some sort of special thing. Yeah,
and indulging that or failing to acknowledge that, writing is like digging a ditch can basically lead to some quite pretentious and alienating films about writers, which I guess is one of the reasons why people haven't liked Mother.
Yeah, I mean, the metaphor of, I don't know, I don't want to tip back into reviewing Mother because we already did that for quite a while, but viewing Mother as a metaphor for creativity and man's abuse of the muse, it's possibly a metaphor that you struggle to draw through the whole film without bringing in some of the biblical stuff, but it's just not that new or thrilling an insight, really.
No.
I suppose you could arguably give Darren Aronofsky credit for being willing to portray the male writer as basically awful, but it's not really going that deep into it. I mean, the character is... if you did view the whole thing as a discussion of writers and muses, it's not really giving me much that I could draw on in my own life because, well, I don't live with a much younger non-writer who I draw on for inspiration. I draw on banging my head against the table and waiting for something to happen for inspiration. And B, the Javier Bardem character is portrayed as such a driven wanker that it's quite hard to really go, I've learned something from this.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. Well, if the problem with stories that focus on writers is this kind of mistaken belief that writing is a kind of universal experience or kind of elevating the writer to, well, in the case of Mother, sort of a godlike level. Maybe a good way to use writing about writers, at least I've found, is to kind of have a writer as a sort of lens through which they view a story. This is kind of related to my insight that the most interesting things in stories about writers is the story the writer's trying to tell, not necessarily the creative process. So, for example, the Heath Ledger film, A Knight's Tale, which is kind of from the point of view of the character Chaucer, who writes down the story, even though he doesn't sort of turn up to about halfway through. And, it's not really a story about writing, although one of the main characters is a writer, and obviously the idea is that we know about the story because of, kind of Chaucer writing it down. But the story itself is the events that kind of go into the work of fiction that comes out of it. And the writer is a good medium for sort of someone who's just there observing events and documenting them.
Well, yeah, inevitably to bring in comics, the fairly well-known comic Transmetropolitan by Warren Ellis and Derek Robertson is about a journalist, Spider Jerusalem, in a horrible future who attempts to, and mild implies spoilers, kind of successfully does, change the world with his amazing journalism, his brutal ranting column about how bad everything is. To be honest, one of the great, increasing, depressing realisations of our horrendous world is that, let's face it, a man ranting cynically in a newspaper or on a website probably wouldn't change the world that much. I think we've successfully got quite a few of those, a lot of them probably influenced by Spider Jerusalem, and the world remains unchanged.
Yeah.
But yeah, Transmetropolitan is a romanticisation fantasy about how amazing it is to be a super influential writer. I think he did at some point describe his keyboard as a gun with one bullet and, shooting a kneecap off the world. I think that's not quite a direct quote, but a borrowed metaphor. Not that I'm saying that, that it's bad for Warren Ellis to do that. Writers shouldn't write about writers, therefore Transmetropolitan is bad. Transmetropolitan is obviously entertaining, but it's only because it's a very, very well-written sort of romantic fantasy, and the trouble with romantic fantasies is it's quite easy to do them badly.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think you've hit on something that the writer as a journalist, or, journalists are a good way to have a writer in your story, because journalists specifically, and writers in general, are sort of people who go around, ask questions, poke their noses into other people's business, and thus uncover stories. It gives them reasons to get involved in whatever the plot is. Like, a good example I thought of this is All the President's Men, which is a great film about journalists uncovering a story. Again, the main characters are writers, but it's not about the process of them, the creative process. It's more about the story they're uncovering.
Yeah, the opposite use of writers, I guess, and this is actually remembering something that Chris Brosnahan, getting his second reference in 2 episodes, said at a writing group, is that, if nothing else, writers are good protagonists because you don't have to work too hard to explain why they're free in the middle of the day to look into the plot when they should be at work.
Yeah.
And if you wanted a comparative example for that, the lead character Steve from Coupling is apparently a writer. Well, partly, I guess, because it's a vaguely autobiographical and he's Stephen Moffat, but also just because it means he's just around all the time. It never really comes up. You hardly ever see him writing. He never talks about his work. It's unclear what kind of writer he even is, but technically he is a writer.
Well, there we go.
Just to free him up.
Yeah, and also so he can get involved in the stories, I suppose, and he's got that kind of slightly nosy writer thing going on.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, one thing I'm getting slightly into my own writing here, I've increasingly found as I try and start more projects, is that, it's good to have a character who has a bit more going on than just being a boring every person, especially if you're trying to write something like novel length or something, or I guess if you want a lead for a whole TV show or movie. It's good to have a character who isn't just a boring every person, and the trouble with writing or making my character a writer is that I suspect I'd see it as, if I did it in an unexamined way, as making the character interesting, when in fact, because I myself am an aspiring writer, it's just basically going to be another boring every person who does something I see as completely boring and standard, and it's going to encourage a certain degree of laziness, I guess. I think possibly even fairly or unfairly, if you're reading something that you know has been written by a writer and you discover the main character's a writer, you're going to sort of roll your eyes and go, oh, lazy. Even if, as I say, it's possibly slightly unfair on the author to think that.
And if it works in the story...
Well, yeah, obviously there's not really a hard rule here. In the same way, there's nothing stopping you using a scary clown if you do it well. There's nothing stopping you writing about a writer if you do it well. But if we think about that too hard, then we can't ask facetious questions and our whole format implodes. So, shh.
Let's not think about that. That's all we have time for today. If you have enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please subscribe in your podcatcher of choice, so that you never miss an episode. While you're there, please leave us a review, as it helps other people find out about the show. You can also visit our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, for more episodes, bonus audio clips, and the occasional written piece by Nick and myself.
And we are also on social media. You can find us on @MFV Podcast on Twitter, or just search Modern Fantasy Violence on Facebook, where we will post the latest news about the show and when we remember our opinions on the latest pop culture news, or we'll retweet them from our own accounts, one or the other. Okay, I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on the internet at nickbryan.com. New fictional content hopefully coming soon. I know I've been saying that for a while, but honest to God. And you can also find me on Twitter as @NickMB.
I've been Alistair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter at AlistairJRBall, or find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. Join us next time, where we'll be discussing Blade Runner 2049, starring Harrison Ford and Ryan Gosling. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye.
Either start with one of those two, I would say, if anyone wants to get into Pink Floyd.
Okay, I have just downloaded it on Spotify. Maybe I'll give it a try. We'll see.
Tune in next time to find out what Nick thought.
Oh, God. Okay.
No, you don't have to.
We'll see.
You can edit that bit out if you want.
I'll tell you what, by the time I release on Thursday, I'll probably have listened to the first track, then I'll decide, or two at least, and then I'll decide if I want to edit it out.